Welcome back to Speakwise podcast. Have you ever noticed that the smartest person in the room is often the quietest? Not because they have nothing to say, but because they know that speaking is only one part of communication. Listening, observing, thinking, choosing the right moment. These are skills that rarely appear in textbooks, yet they shape almost every meaningful conversation. Today, you're not going to learn how to speak more. You're going to discover why sometimes speaking less makes your English sound even more natural, more confident, and more intelligent. So, grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and let's spend the next hour together exploring one of the most overlooked communication skills in the English-speaking world. If you enjoy thoughtful conversations that help you think and speak like an educated native speaker, don't forget to subscribe to Speakwise podcast. We publish new advanced C1-C2 listening episodes every week. The café was unusually quiet that Saturday morning. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Only a handful of people sat inside, each absorbed in a book, a laptop, or their own thoughts. Emma arrived first. She placed her umbrella beside the chair and looked around the room. A few months ago, silence like this would have made her uncomfortable. She would have reached for her phone immediately. Now, she simply watched. Steam rose gently from a cup of coffee at the next table. A young couple smiled without saying much. An elderly man slowly turned the pages of a newspaper. Nothing remarkable was happening. Yet somehow, everything felt peaceful. Sarah arrived a few minutes later. She noticed Emma looking out the window. "What are you thinking about?" Emma smiled. "I'm actually not thinking very much." Sarah laughed. "That's surprisingly difficult these days." Emma nodded. "I used to believe silence meant something was wrong. If nobody was talking, I felt like someone needed to fill the space." "And now?" Sarah asked. "I've started appreciating it." Before Sarah could respond, Michael walked into the cafe carrying a notebook. Alex followed behind him, balancing 2 cups of coffee. Sophia came in last, quietly greeting everyone before taking her usual seat. After a few minutes of casual conversation, Sarah looked around the table. "I noticed something interesting." Everyone looked at her. "Since we sat down, we've barely spoken." Alex smiled. "And yet, it doesn't feel awkward." Sarah nodded. "Exactly. Why do you think that is?" Michael answered first. "Because we're comfortable." Sophia tilted her head. "I think it's something else." "What?" Michael asked. "I think silence only feels uncomfortable when we believe we're being judged." Emma looked intrigued. "I've never thought about it that way." Sophia continued. "Imagine sitting next to a close friend. You can spend an hour together without speaking. It feels completely natural. But sit in an elevator with strangers for 30 seconds. And suddenly, everyone becomes fascinated by the ceiling." Everyone laughed. Alex nodded. "Or their phone. Especially their phone." Sarah smiled. "Why do you think people do that?" Alex shrugged. "Because silence makes people self-conscious. We start wondering, do I look awkward? Should I say something? What are they thinking about me?" Emma smiled. "I've definitely done that." "So have I," Michael admitted. Sarah leaned back. "Here's something I've noticed after years of meeting people from different cultures. In many places, the person who speaks the most is often seen as confident. But in others, the person who listens the most earns the greatest respect." The group became quiet. This time, no one rushed to answer. "Repeat after me. Silence doesn't always need to be filled." Repeat. "Listening is part of communication." Repeat. "I don't have to speak immediately." Repeat. Excellent. Michael broke the silence. "I think we've confused confidence with visibility." Sarah looked interested. "What do you mean?" "We assume confident people are always talking. But some of the most confident people I've met hardly spoke at all." Alex smiled. "I had a professor like that. The entire class talked constantly. He barely interrupted. But whenever he finally spoke, everyone listened." Emma looked curious. "What made him different?" Alex smiled. "He never spoke just to be heard. He spoke because he had something worth saying. Nobody said anything for a moment. Sarah quietly smiled. That's an important distinction. Talking is easy. Contributing is much harder. Sophia nodded. I've noticed something similar in meetings. The loudest voice often gets the most attention, but not always the most respect. Michael laughed. I've seen people speak for 10 minutes and say almost nothing. Everyone smiled. Emma looked thoughtful. So, speaking more doesn't necessarily make people think you're smarter. Sarah shook her head. Not at all. In fact, research often suggests the opposite. The people who ask thoughtful questions are frequently remembered as the most intelligent. Emma raised an eyebrow. Really? Sarah nodded. When you ask a good question, you're showing curiosity, you're showing confidence, and you're giving someone else the opportunity to share. Alex smiled. I've noticed that good leaders do that. They ask far more questions than they answer. Michael nodded. My manager is exactly like that. He rarely begins a meeting by telling everyone what to do. He usually starts with, "What do you think?" Or, "What are we missing?" Sophia smiled. Those questions completely change the atmosphere. People stop defending themselves. They start thinking together. Repeat after me. That's a thoughtful question. Repeat. What are we missing? Repeat. I'd love to hear your perspective. Repeat. Excellent. Emma looked around the table. I think I've been misunderstanding confidence. Sarah smiled. How so? I always imagined confident people were quick. They answered immediately. They always had an opinion. Michael shook his head gently. I think confident people are comfortable waiting. They don't panic when there's silence. They're not afraid to think. Alex nodded. That's true. The older I get, the more I admire people who respond slowly. Emma laughed. You admire slow responses? I do. Alex smiled. It usually means they're considering their words. They're responding, not reacting. Sarah looked at everyone. I'd like to try something. She glanced toward the large window, where the rain continued to fall. For the next 30 seconds, let's not say anything. No phones. No distractions. Just observe. Nobody objected. The room became completely silent. Emma noticed the rhythm of the rain. Michael watched steam rising from his coffee. Sophia noticed a little girl helping her grandfather fold an umbrella near the entrance. Alex watched a barista carefully drawing a heart in someone's latte. 30 seconds passed. Sarah smiled. What did you notice? Emma answered first. I noticed things I would have missed. Michael nodded. So did I. Alex smiled. I realized something. What? Sarah asked. My mind became quieter. Sophia looked at him. Or perhaps, you simply started listening. No one replied, because everyone knew she was right. Repeat after me. I notice more when I slow down. Repeat. Listening begins with attention. Repeat. Silence helps me think clearly. Repeat. Excellent. Sarah looked around the table one more time. I think today's conversation isn't really about silence. Everyone waited. It's about awareness. The ability to notice, to understand, and to choose your words instead of letting your words choose you. Emma smiled. I have a feeling this conversation is going to challenge a lot of what I believe. Sarah returned the smile. I hope so. The best conversations usually do. Today's native tip. Highly proficient native speakers are comfortable with short pauses. They don't feel pressured to answer immediately. Instead, they use expressions like, that's an interesting question. Let me think about that for a second. Or, give me a moment. These natural pauses make them sound thoughtful, calm, and confident rather than hesitant. Repeat after me. That's an interesting question. Repeat. Let me think about that for a second. Repeat. Give me a moment. Repeat. Excellent. Now it's time for today's listening challenge. Listen carefully. Sarah says, talking is easy. Contributing is much harder. What does she mean? A. Speaking for a long time makes people sound more intelligent. B. Meaningful communication is about adding value to a conversation, not simply talking more. C. The best conversations are the ones where everyone talks continuously. The correct answer is B. Excellent. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Inside the café, no one felt the need to rush the conversation. For the first time that morning, everyone began to understand that silence wasn't the absence of communication. Sometimes, it was the beginning of it. Sarah looked around the table with a thoughtful smile. Can I ask everyone another question? Alex laughed. I had a feeling you weren't finished. Sarah smiled. Do you know the fastest way to make someone feel important? Emma thought for a moment. Compliment them? Sometimes, Sarah replied. Michael offered another idea. Remember their name. That's helpful too. Sophia quietly added. Listen without interrupting. Sarah smiled immediately. I think that's the closest answer. She looked around the table. Most people don't actually want advice. They want to feel understood. Emma leaned forward. Is there really that much of a difference? Michael nodded. A huge difference. When someone immediately gives advice, they're often solving a problem the other person hasn't finished explaining. Alex laughed. I've definitely done that. So have I, Emma admitted. Sarah looked at them. I think we've all done it. Because silence makes us uncomfortable. When someone pauses, we assume they're finished. But sometimes, they're simply gathering the courage to continue. Nobody spoke. The idea seemed to settle naturally around the table. Sophia finally broke the silence. I remember something that happened a few years ago. Everyone turned toward her. A close friend invited me to lunch. I assumed she wanted to catch up. But after we ordered our food, she became unusually quiet. I asked if everything was okay. She looked at me for several seconds before saying, I don't think I've been happy for a very long time. Emma looked concerned. What did you say? Sophia smiled softly. Nothing. Everyone looked surprised. You said nothing? Sophia nodded. I simply stayed with her. I let the silence exist. After about 20 seconds, she kept talking. For nearly an hour. When we finished, she thanked me. Alex frowned slightly. But you hardly spoke. Exactly. Sophia smiled. She didn't need answers. She needed space. Sarah looked at Emma. What do you think about that? Emma slowly nodded. I think I would have tried to fix everything. I would have offered advice. I would have searched for solutions. Michael smiled. Most of us would. But listening requires a different kind of confidence. What kind? Emma asked. The confidence to admit, I don't have to solve every problem. Sarah nodded. I love that. We often believe helping means talking. Sometimes helping means staying. Repeat after me. I'm here to listen. Repeat. Take your time. Repeat. I'm listening. Repeat. Excellent. Alex looked thoughtful. I think social media has made this even harder. Sarah smiled. How so? We've become addicted to immediate reactions. Someone shares an opinion. Within seconds, hundreds of people are responding. Very few are reflecting. Sophia nodded. Everything feels urgent. Every opinion, every headline, every disagreement. Michael added. But wisdom usually isn't immediate. It takes time. It requires reflection. Emma looked curious. So slowing down isn't weakness. It's discipline. Sarah smiled. I couldn't have said it better myself. She looked around the cafe. Have you ever noticed that people who remain calm during disagreements often influence others more? Alex nodded immediately. Absolutely. The loudest person rarely changes anyone's mind. The calmest person often does. Michael laughed. I learned that the hard way. What happened? Emma asked. I used to think winning an argument meant speaking louder. One day, my mentor stopped me. He said, Michael, if your volume is increasing, your influence is probably decreasing. Everyone laughed. He was right. The moment I stopped trying to win, my conversations became far more productive. Sarah smiled. That's because people don't like being defeated. They like being understood, Sophia added. And when people feel understood, they become willing to listen. Repeat after me. People listen when they feel understood. Repeat. Calm communication creates trust. Repeat. Respect opens more doors than pressure. Repeat. Excellent. The rain outside became heavier. Inside, the café grew warmer. A young father sat near the window with his daughter. She excitedly pointed at the raindrops racing down the glass. The father didn't interrupt her. He simply smiled and listened. Emma watched them for a moment. I think children naturally teach us something. Sarah looked toward the window. What do you mean? They don't rush conversations. They tell stories slowly. They notice tiny details. And when adults really listen, they become even more excited. Michael smiled. That's true. My nephew can spend 10 minutes explaining why he thinks clouds move differently on weekends. Everyone laughed. And honestly, it's fascinating because I know he's completely serious. Sophia smiled. Children don't speak to impress. They speak because they're curious. Sarah nodded. Maybe that's why conversations with children often feel so genuine. They haven't learned to perform yet. Alex looked thoughtful. Do you think adults spend too much time performing? Sarah paused for a second. I think many of us do. We carefully choose words that make us appear intelligent, successful, interesting. But sometimes, we forget to be authentic. Emma quietly asked, Can authenticity be learned? Sarah smiled. I believe so. It begins the moment you stop asking, How do I sound? And start asking, Am I being honest? Nobody spoke. It was one of those ideas that felt surprisingly simple, yet surprisingly difficult to practice. Repeat after me. I choose honesty over perfection. Repeat. Authentic conversations build stronger relationships. Repeat. I don't need to impress everyone. Repeat. Excellent. Sarah looked around the table once more. You know what fascinates me most? Everyone waited. The greatest communicators I've ever met weren't remarkable because they spoke beautifully. They were remarkable because people felt safe speaking to them. Emma smiled. I think that's the kind of person I want to become. Sarah nodded. I think that's the kind of communicator we're all trying to become. Today's native tip. In natural American English, skilled conversationalists often encourage others to continue speaking with small, supportive expressions rather than interrupting. Phrases like, Go on. I'm with you. That makes sense. And I see what you mean show active listening and make conversations flow smoothly without taking control. Repeat after me. Go on. Repeat. I'm with you. Repeat. I see what you mean. Repeat. That makes sense. Repeat. Excellent. Now, it's time for today's listening challenge. Listen carefully. Sophia says, she didn't need answers. She needed space. What does Sophia mean? A. Her friend wanted to sit alone in silence. B. Her friend needed time, patience, and someone willing to listen without interrupting or trying to solve the problem immediately. C. Her friend wanted advice, but didn't receive it. The correct answer is B. Excellent. As the rain continued tapping gently against the windows, everyone around the table began to realize that the most powerful words in a conversation were not always the ones that were spoken. Sometimes, the greatest gift you can offer another person is your full attention. The conversation drifted naturally into another quiet pause. No one seemed eager to break it. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt comfortable. Sarah smiled. I think we're discovering something. Alex looked up. What's that? We've spent almost an hour talking about silence. And somehow, we've learned more from the pauses than from many of the words. Michael laughed softly. That's strangely true. Emma rested her hands around her coffee cup. Can I ask something? Always, Sarah replied. Why do some people make us feel completely comfortable after just a few minutes, while others make every conversation feel exhausting? Sophia smiled. That's a wonderful question. Michael nodded. I've wondered the same thing. Sarah took a slow sip of her coffee. I don't think it's about personality. What do you think it is? Emma asked. I think it's attention. Everyone looked at her. The people who make us feel comfortable usually aren't thinking about themselves. They're thinking about us. Alex smiled. So they're not worrying about sounding smart. They're interested instead of interesting. Sarah pointed toward him. Exactly. I once heard someone say, the most charismatic people aren't the ones who tell the best stories. They're the ones who make you want to tell yours. Nobody spoke. Emma quietly repeated the sentence. They make you want to tell your story. I like that. Michael smiled. I had a colleague exactly like that. He wasn't particularly funny. He wasn't loud. He wasn't the most experienced person in the company. But somehow, everyone trusted him. Emma looked curious. What made him different? He remembered little things. If your daughter had an exam, he'd ask about it a week later. If you mentioned your mother wasn't feeling well, he'd remember months afterward. He listened as if your life genuinely mattered. Sophia nodded. People never forget how carefully you listened. They may forget your words, but they'll remember how they felt around you. Repeat after me. People remember how you make them feel. Repeat. Attention is a form of respect. Repeat. Listening builds trust. Repeat. Excellent. Alex looked thoughtful. I think we've misunderstood charisma. Sarah smiled. In what way? We often imagine charismatic people walking into a room and immediately becoming the center of attention. But maybe real charisma does the opposite. Emma tilted her head. What do you mean? They make everyone else feel like the center of attention. Michael laughed. I've met people exactly like that. You leave the conversation thinking, they're amazing. But if someone asks what they actually said, you can barely remember. What you remember is how they made you feel. Sarah nodded. That's one of the greatest communication skills anyone can develop. People aren't searching for perfect speakers. They're searching for people who make them feel heard. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. A beam of sunlight broke through the clouds, filling the café with a warm golden light. Emma looked toward the window. Can I admit something? Of course. I've always been nervous during conversations with native speakers. Sarah nodded gently. Why? I was so focused on speaking correctly that I barely listened. Everyone smiled knowingly. Michael laughed. I've done exactly the same thing. I was rehearsing my next sentence. While the other person was still talking, Alex smiled. I think every language learner has experienced that. Sarah leaned forward. Here's the interesting part. When you're worrying about grammar, you're usually paying attention to yourself. But when you're truly listening, your attention shifts toward the other person. And suddenly, the conversation becomes much easier. Emma looked surprised. So, listening actually helps speaking? Sarah smiled. I think listening creates speaking. The better you listen, the more naturally you respond. Sophia nodded. Because you're no longer performing. You're participating. Repeat after me. I focus on the other person. Repeat. Listening makes speaking easier. Repeat. Conversations are shared experiences. Repeat. Excellent. A waiter approached the table. Would anyone like another coffee? Everyone politely declined. As he walked away, Alex smiled. Did you notice something? What? Emma asked. He never interrupted us. He waited until there was a natural pause. Sarah laughed. That's actually a perfect example. Good communicators don't force themselves into conversations. They recognize timing. Michael nodded. Timing changes everything. The same sentence can sound thoughtful or insensitive, depending on when you say it. Sophia added, that's why emotional intelligence matters so much. It's not only knowing what to say, it's knowing when to say it. Emma looked thoughtful. I've always focused on vocabulary, but maybe I should pay more attention to timing. Sarah smiled. I think advanced English is much more about timing than vocabulary. The words matter, But the moment matters too. Alex laughed. I wish someone had taught me that years ago. I spent years learning complicated expressions, when all I really needed was to become a better listener. Nobody argued, because everyone around the table had reached the same conclusion. Sarah looked around the café. You know, when we began today's conversation, we asked why intelligent people often stay quiet. She smiled. I don't think we've found the complete answer, but I think we've discovered something more important. Michael looked at her. What's that? Silence isn't impressive by itself. Listening isn't valuable by itself. They only become meaningful when they're motivated by genuine curiosity. Emma smiled. So, staying quiet isn't the goal. Sarah nodded. No, the goal is understanding. And sometimes, understanding requires words. Sometimes, it requires silence. But it always requires attention. The group fell quiet once more. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because every person at the table was thinking about someone in their own life, someone who had truly listened, someone who had changed them without speaking very much at all. Today's native tip. In advanced conversations, native speakers often use reflective responses instead of immediately giving opinions. Expressions like, "That's interesting," "I've never thought about it that way," "That's worth thinking about," and "I'm curious what led you to that conclusion," encourage deeper discussions and show genuine engagement. Repeat after me. That's worth thinking about. Repeat. I'm curious what led you to that conclusion. Repeat. I've never thought about it that way. Repeat. Excellent. Now it's time for today's listening challenge. Listen carefully. Sarah says, silence and listening only become meaningful when they're motivated by genuine curiosity. What does she mean? A. Remaining quiet automatically makes people appear intelligent. B. Listening is valuable only when it comes from a sincere desire to understand another person. C. The less you speak, the smarter people will think you are. The correct answer is B. Excellent. As the sunlight slowly replaced the rain outside, everyone at the table realized they had stopped trying to become better English speakers. Instead, they had quietly begun becoming better communicators. And perhaps, in the end, those two journeys were never really separate. The afternoon sunlight slowly returned, casting long golden reflections across the wooden floor of the café. The atmosphere had changed. Not dramatically, just enough for everyone to notice. People spoke a little more softly. They smiled a little more often. Perhaps thoughtful conversations had a way of changing not only the people involved, but also the way the world seemed to feel around them. Sarah glanced outside before turning back to the group. I'd like to ask one last question before we finish today's discussion. Alex smiled. I don't think any of us are surprised anymore. Sarah laughed. I'll take that as a compliment. She folded her hands on the table. Who is the wisest person you've ever met? Nobody answered immediately. Emma looked thoughtful. I don't think the wisest person I've known was the most educated. Michael nodded. Neither was mine. Sophia smiled. My grandmother never finished high school, but every conversation with her felt like reading an entire book. Alex laughed. My grandfather was exactly the same. Sarah looked around the table. What made them wise? Sophia answered first. They never rushed to judge people. If someone made a mistake, they became curious before becoming critical. Emma looked surprised. Curious? Sophia nodded. My grandmother used to ask, I wonder what they're going through. Instead of saying, I can't believe they did that. Sarah smiled warmly. That single question changes everything. Michael leaned forward. I think judgment ends conversations. Curiosity begins them. Emma slowly nodded. I've noticed something. The older I become, the less interested I am in deciding who's right. I'm much more interested in understanding why people think the way they do. Alex smiled. I think that's maturity. Sarah gently shook her head. I think it's empathy. Nobody corrected her, because both answers felt true. Repeat after me. I choose curiosity before judgment. Repeat. Everyone has a story I cannot see. Repeat. Understanding begins with empathy. Repeat. Excellent. A young couple entered the café and quietly took a seat near the window. For several minutes, they barely spoke. Instead, they smiled at each other while sharing a slice of cake. Emma noticed them. They haven't said much. Sarah looked over. No, but they're communicating. Emma laughed softly, without words. Michael smiled. We often forget that communication isn't only verbal. Sophia nodded. A smile. A pause. Eye contact. A gentle tone. They all communicate something, Alex added. Sometimes the words matter the least. Sarah looked at everyone. Have you ever had a conversation where you couldn't remember a single sentence, but you never forgot how it made you feel? Everyone nodded. Emma smiled. I remember one. It happened years ago. I was having a terrible week. I met an old teacher by accident. We talked for maybe 10 minutes. I honestly can't remember what we discussed, but I remember walking away, feeling lighter. Michael smiled. I've experienced that too. I think some people have a gift. They make you feel accepted, not because they agree with everything you say, but because they allow you to be yourself. Sarah nodded. And that's something language learners often overlook. We spend years trying to pronounce every word perfectly, but the conversations people remember usually have very little to do with pronunciation. Emma looked curious. So what do people remember? Sarah smiled. They remember whether you were present. They remember whether you listened. They remember whether they felt respected. Alex quietly added. Presence has become rare. Everyone looked at him. We're surrounded by distractions. Our phones, our notifications, our thoughts. Sometimes we're physically present, but mentally somewhere else. Sophia nodded. I think attention has become one of the greatest gifts we can give another person. Michael smiled. And one of the rarest. Repeat after me. I give people my full attention. Repeat. Being present is a gift. Repeat. I listen with my eyes, my ears, and my heart. Repeat. Excellent. Sarah leaned back in her chair. I read an article recently that asked an interesting question. Emma smiled. What was it? If someone talked to you the way you talk to yourself, would you want to spend time with them? The table became completely silent. Emma lowered her eyes. Probably not. Michael sighed. I don't think I would either. Alex laughed quietly. We're often much kinder to strangers than we are to ourselves. Sophia looked thoughtful. Maybe that's where confidence really begins. Sarah smiled. How so? Learning to become someone you'd actually enjoy talking to. Emma looked up. I've never thought about self-talk as a conversation. Sarah nodded. But it is. And it's probably the longest conversation you'll ever have. Michael smiled. If that's true, it might be the most important one. Nobody spoke. The idea stayed with everyone. Outside, the clouds had completely disappeared. Warm afternoon light filled the cafe once again. Sarah looked at the group. You know, when people ask how to become a better English speaker, they usually expect advice about vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation. She smiled. Those things matter. But today we've spent nearly 2 hours talking about something completely different. Emma laughed. And somehow, it still feels like an English lesson. Sarah smiled. I hope it feels like something more. I hope it feels like practice for life. Michael nodded. Because every language is really about relationships. Sophia added, and every meaningful relationship begins with listening. Alex looked around the table. I think we've finally answered today's question. Sarah smiled. Have we? Alex nodded. Smart people don't stay quiet because they have nothing to say. They stay quiet long enough to understand what truly needs to be said. Nobody responded. There was nothing left to add. The silence itself completed the thought. Today's native tip. One habit, shared by many highly proficient English speakers, is that they don't rush to tell stories about themselves. Instead, they ask follow-up questions that encourage the other person to continue. Expressions like, "What happened after that? How did that make you feel?" And, "What did you learn from that experience?" naturally deepen conversations and make people feel genuinely heard. Repeat after me. What happened after that? Repeat. How did that make you feel? Repeat. What did you learn from that experience? Repeat. Excellent. Now it's time for today's listening challenge. Listen carefully. Alex says, "Smart people don't stay quiet because they have nothing to say. They stay quiet long enough to understand what truly needs to be said." What is Alex suggesting? A. Intelligent people avoid conversations whenever possible. B. Wise communicators pause to understand the situation before choosing their words carefully. C. The fewer words you use, the more intelligent you automatically appear. The correct answer is B. Excellent. As the warm sunlight filled every corner of the café, the conversation gently moved toward its final moments. No one felt they had won an argument. No one had tried to. Instead, everyone had gained something far more valuable, a deeper understanding of what it truly means to communicate with wisdom. The conversation slowed naturally. No one seemed to notice how much time had passed. The coffee cups were nearly empty. The afternoon crowd had begun to replace the quiet morning visitors. Outside, the streets glistened after the rain. People walked by carrying shopping bags, holding umbrellas, laughing with friends, or simply enjoying the cool air. Inside the cafe, Sarah looked around the table with a gentle smile. "I think today has reminded me of something." Emma looked up. "What is it?" Sarah took a slow breath. "Communication isn't a performance. It's a relationship." Michael nodded. "I wish more people understood that. We spend so much energy trying to sound impressive, but very little energy trying to understand." Sophia smiled. "Maybe that's because understanding takes patience." Alex laughed softly. "And patience isn't exactly fashionable anymore." Everyone smiled. Emma rested her chin on her hand. "Can I ask one final question?" "Of course," Sarah replied. "What do you think people remember most after a conversation?" Michael answered first. "They remember how they felt." Sophia nodded. "I agree. I've forgotten hundreds of conversations, but I've never forgotten the people who made me feel safe." Alex added, "Or the people who made me feel invisible." The table became quiet. Sarah looked at Alex. "That's an important distinction. We all remember being ignored. We all remember being interrupted. And we all remember the rare moments when someone listened as though nothing else in the world mattered." Emma smiled. "I think that's what I want to become." Sarah tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "I don't just want to speak fluent English. I want people to enjoy talking with me. I want them to leave a conversation feeling encouraged." Michael smiled. "I think that's a much better goal. Fluency helps people understand your words. Kindness helps people remember you." Repeat after me. Kindness makes communication meaningful. Repeat. People remember how I make them feel. Repeat. Every conversation is an opportunity to connect. Repeat. Excellent. Sarah looked toward the window. "You know, when we first started today's discussion, we asked why smart people often stay quiet." She smiled. "I don't think silence was ever the real lesson." Emma looked curious. "What was?" Sarah answered calmly. "Intentional communication. Knowing when to speak. Knowing when to listen. Knowing when someone needs advice. And knowing when they simply need your presence." Sophia nodded. "I think wisdom is balance. Too much talking, and we stop listening. Too much silence, and we stop sharing. The goal isn't choosing one over the other. It's learning when each one serves another person." Michael smiled. "That reminds me of something my father used to say." Everyone looked toward him. "He always told me, before you speak, ask yourself 3 questions. Is it true? Is it necessary? Is it kind?" If the answer wasn't yes to all 3, he suggested waiting. Emma smiled. I love that. Alex laughed. I probably would have avoided a lot of embarrassing moments if I'd followed that advice. Everyone laughed with him. Sarah looked around the table. I have one last exercise for all of us. Everyone waited. The next time you have a conversation, don't focus on sounding intelligent. Don't focus on using advanced vocabulary. Don't even focus on speaking perfectly. She paused. Instead, become genuinely interested in the other person. Ask one thoughtful question. Listen without interrupting. Notice what they're not saying. And before you leave, make sure they feel heard. Nobody said anything. Not because they disagreed, because every person around the table knew exactly how rare that experience had become. Emma smiled. I think today's lesson wasn't really about English. Sarah smiled back. No, I think today's lesson was about becoming the kind of person people trust. Michael looked around the café. You know what's interesting? What? Alex asked. We've been sitting here for hours. I don't think anyone tried to impress anyone. And somehow, this has been one of the most interesting conversations I've had in a long time. Sophia smiled. Because everyone came to understand. Not to win. Sarah stood up slowly. I think that's the perfect place to end. Everyone gathered their coats. The waiters smiled as they walked toward the door. See you again next week? Sarah smiled. I hope so. The group stepped outside. The air smelled fresh after the rain. For a few seconds, no one spoke. They simply stood together, watching the sunlight break through the clouds. Emma finally smiled. You know, a few months ago, I would have felt uncomfortable with this silence. She looked at the others. Now it feels peaceful. Sarah nodded. That's because you've learned something much bigger than vocabulary. You've learned that silence isn't something to fear. It's something to understand. The group began walking down the sidewalk together. No one hurried. No one felt the need to fill every quiet moment. Some conversations continue, even after the words have ended. Today's native tip, one of the strongest signs of an advanced English speaker, is emotional awareness. Instead of thinking only about what to say next, pay attention to how the other person is feeling. Native speakers naturally adjust their tone, pace, and word choice depending on the situation. Great communication is not only about speaking accurately, it's about helping the other person feel comfortable, respected, and understood. Repeat after me. I'd love to hear more. Repeat. Take your time. I'm listening. Repeat. Thank you for sharing that with me. Repeat. I appreciate your perspective. Repeat. Excellent. Now it's time for today's listening challenge. Listen carefully. Sarah says, the next time you have a conversation, don't focus on sounding intelligent. Instead, become genuinely interested in the other person and make sure they leave feeling heard. What is Sarah encouraging listeners to do? A. Memorize more advanced vocabulary before speaking. B. Focus on creating genuine human connection by listening with curiosity and empathy. C. Avoid speaking unless absolutely necessary. The correct answer is B. Excellent. As the café disappeared behind them and the afternoon slowly turned into evening, everyone carried home something that couldn't be written in a notebook or memorized from a vocabulary list. They carried a new understanding. The smartest people are not always the ones who speak the most. They are often the ones who make others feel comfortable enough to speak. And perhaps that is the greatest communication skill of all. Thank you so much for spending this time with us on Speakwise podcast. If today's conversation helped you think differently about communication, listening, or confidence, we'd love for you to join us again next week. Subscribe to Speakwise podcast for more advanced C1-C2 English listening experiences designed to help you think, communicate, and connect like an educated native speaker. Until next time, stay curious, listen deeply, speak with intention, and never stop growing through the conversations you share. Take care, and we'll see you in the next episode.